that you can reach out to us. Of course, you can also chat to us by live streaming. We are on all the socials, on TikTok, we are on YouTube, we are on X as well, at Channel Africa 1. Listen to us live on OpenView Channel 628, and we are on the DSTV audio bouquet. We are on Channel 808. So, to our top stories at this hour. Israel says a controversial aid mechanism bypassing the United Nations and charities has begun operating in the Gaza Strip following the resignation of its head. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation will employ private American security contractors to oversee a process where selected Palestinians will pick up food for their families from distribution points. Juliet Tuma is the Director of Communications at the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency, UNRWA.
We fundamentally oppose this a new plan that we understand is supported by both the governments of Israel and the United States, that there is a system in place that we can use, including through UNRWA. Why reinvent the wheel? The needs are known to everyone. We need to get in 500, 600 trucks of supplies every single day. That can only be done through the United Nations under the leadership of UNRWA.
The African Development Bank Group is to elect a new president this week. The bank's annual gathering is set to kick off in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire. South Africa backs Baja Bulile Swazi Shabalala to succeed the outgoing president, Akinwumi Adesina. There are 4 other candidates, though, including Zambia's Samuel Maimbo. Kailihle Kumalo reports from Abidjan.
It comes at a very critical time globally with a number of geopolitical challenges. We know that with the aid being cut off, a number of countries were affected here in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a very crucial time for the new leadership of the African Development Bank to look at the domestic resources, how they can mobilize these resources for a number of African countries, but also tackling a myriad of challenges that are facing the African continent, from the issues of debt sustainability in terms of making sure that they're able to absorb all these shocks, but also a very tough global environment. Also, you look at a number of issues around climate change, really having a knock-on effect in so many countries right in Africa.
And agricultural scientists from G20 member states have converged on the South African town of Polokwane for a summit aimed at reducing food insecurity. Scientists and policymakers will deliberate on scientific innovations to ensure sustainable farming aimed at the global warming challenge. All G20 countries have sent a delegation of scientists to Polokwane to participate in the meeting, except for the United States. Chief Scientist at South Africa's Agricultural Research Council, Dr. Lerato Matsunyane, has more.
So in terms of our contribution as the Agricultural Research Council, we were tasked with the various issues that we had to lead with. And this includes the transformation of agricultural food systems. We are looking at biodiversity, climate change and risk management, as well as bioeconomy within the agricultural sector. But we did not have these discussions in a silo format. This is where we then had our concept notes that we drafted, following which we engaged all scientists within the different sectors. We started with discussions, obviously, within the Agricultural Research Council. We then diverged to scientists and community members within the agricultural sector in West Africa, in East Africa, in Northern Africa, including Southern Africa. And this is where it shows that as we exceed in agricultural research, it is not only for South Africa, but we're looking at the African continent as a whole.
And now the South African Federation of Trade Unions has written to the chairperson of Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Communications and Digital Technologies, requesting an urgent meeting regarding a recently gazetted policy directive for the ICT sector. This follows Minister Solly Maladzi's announcement of proposed changes to the triple BEE policies in the ICT sector. These changes could allow companies to invest in the country without actually having to adhere to the 30% ownership regulations. Safety General Secretary Zwelinzima Mavavu says they view Maladzi's move as government being played during last week's meeting at the White House.
We have just written a letter to the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Communication and Digital Technologies to ask for an urgent discussion so that we can raise with the committee our disgust and alarm that Honorable Solly Maladzi is now pursuing actions that could potentially undermine South Africa's established regulatory frameworks, including laws governing spectrum licensing, ownership requirements, and data sovereignty.
At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Tshepiso Mokwetla.
Channel Africa.
7 minutes past 9, it is Africa World Hour. Good to be back with you, and I hope that Thabiso Lekoko has been taking good care of you as we continue with Africa World Hour, telling you what's happening in and around your world, and of course beyond your oceans, wherever you are. We'd like to give you the African perspective. We'd like to give you every perspective that matters, so it's up to you to reach out to us and let us know what perspective we should be putting out on the channel. As per your views, we are on X at Channel Africa 1, also on YouTube, TikTok and Instagram at Channel Africa 1 as well. On Facebook, it's just simply Channel Africa. So let's find out what's happening in and around your world. So the Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania on Saturday has heard that while some African countries have made strides and progress on strengthening their institutions and promoting good governance, others continue to struggle. The sentiments were echoed by Tanzanian Minister for Information, Culture and Arts Sports, Professor Palamagamba Kabudi. He says with corruption, weak accountability and the limitations in the rule of law, Africa still suffers from regal pluralism and remains a hostage of the legal catchers of the colonial area. Nhlanhla Mahlangu reports.
The University of South Africa, in partnership with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the government of Tanzania, and the Mwalimu Nyerere Foundation, hosted the 15th annual Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, under the theme, The State of the Continent. Professor Palagamba Kabudi says the state of governance and the rule of law in Africa today presents a complex and evolving landscape. He says the trajectory of the states of governance varies significantly across the continent, with ongoing challenges and some notable successes.
Let us make progress of adopting the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. And that was the issue of self-determination, but also the issue of Africa asserting itself. So we need to strengthen the African Code of Human and People's Rights based at Arusha, but at the same time, in tackling issues of corruption and accountability, we need now to transform the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption, which is also based in Arusha, not to be an advisory board, but actually to be an institution which will now tackle issues.
Tanzanian author and academic emeritus Professor Isa Shivji says new liberalism and the state adjustment programs over the last 3 decades have had devastating effects on societies.
It destroyed the social fabric of our societies. Our societies become extremely polarized, with a small group of people obscenely rich and a large majority of the people filthy poor. Go to any African countries. Once you step outside the main highways and streets, you will see the poverty. And in our villages, to this day, there was rise in absolute relative poverty. Figures are there. Unemployment rising by the day. Today we all talk about youth unemployment. It's a real issue in Africa. But few of us are prepared to admit that partly, if not wholly, is due to the kind of policies that imposed on us and which we embraced. These leaders who eat first, embraced them, because they could continue eating first. It was in their interest. to embrace them.
In responding to the discussion, Sabato Nyamsenda, a PhD student in political science at the University of Dar es Salaam, says challenges that Africa faces are not a call to despair, but a call to action.
We are saying this state which oppresses its people, internally very strong, but externally very weak. We want to change things upside down, to subject it to popular power, okay, so that the people can decide how to govern themselves. So a lot of power should be in the hands of the people themselves, while the state should be strong externally when dealing with external powers. Now, these are two very radical demands which we think cannot be implemented by the current setup of the African states. Because first, they are disunited, second, they are too weak, and third, they are presided by a class, a ruling class that is not committed to the radical transformation of African people. It's a class that accumulates for itself, which serves foreign interests rather than the interests of Africa.
Reporting for Channel Africa, I am Tlantla Mahlangu.
Vue d'Afrique avec Joël Mouteba.
Alors peut-on considérer cette décision comme un désengagement durable des États-Unis vis-à-vis du développement africain ou s'agit-il d'un simple réalignement stratégique?
Non, ça peut être les deux à la fois. Donc, au lieu de donner de l'argent à la Banque africaine de développement pour partager en vrac, ils préfèrent maintenant donc cibler les pays partenaires en Afrique. Ça, c'est pour le réalignement stratégique. Alors, et aussi, ce n'est pas un désengagement durable, mais je pense que dans les 2 ou 3 prochaines années, il veut d'abord remettre de l'ordre dans ses affaires.
Vue d'Afrique, du lundi au vendredi de 15h à 16h, temps universel.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it's 13 minutes past 9. Now, the African Development Bank will elect a new president this week when the continent's biggest multilateral lender faces unprecedented challenges from funding cuts by the United States governments and other things. The first order in office for one of the 5 candidates is to persuade the U.S. to reinstate the funding or seek additional funds from non-regional members of the bank like China or Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. For more on this, Channel Africa's Mabu Boloka spoke to SABC News reporter Kailihle Khumalo, who is currently in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, for the AfDB's presidential vote.
Well, obviously, Tommy, this is quite important. We know that, for example, South Africa is backing Bajabulile Swazi Shabalala. So they say she's got the acumen. She used to be the vice president of the African Development Bank. And even at the recent Africa CEO Forum that was recently held in Abidjan, President Cyril Ramaphosa again was on the campaign trail alongside Ms. Shabalala, really selling her candidature to the member states. So they do say that she's somebody with a know-how, but of course there are other candidates as well. We know that there's Samuel Mambo from Zambia, but also that one is backed by the SADC region. This has almost created like a rift within the bloc because you have those who are supporting a South African candidates, but also within the Zambian bloc as well. So there are other countries as well. The former finance minister in Mauritania, and also we do understand in Senegal as well. So in total, it's about 5 candidates. And we do understand that, Tammy, then come the 29th of May, that's when the election will take place.
And now the biggest issue at the moment is funding of the bank. Can you take us through some of the discussions around this?
I think it's a very critical time, Tammy, especially because of the geopolitical shift in so many parts of the world, the development with the return of the U.S. President Donald Trump, and just the impacts thereof, especially with the tariffs, albeit with a 90-day pause, but creating almost this uncertainty. So just the discussions here, the self-sufficiency, that's a key words that are being used here by the African member states in terms of making sure that they mobilize their own on resources, especially also as we know that aid has been cut off by Washington, D.C. So it's a very important time for Africa to mobilize its own resources, but obviously in terms of the shareholding within the member states, you know that you're predominantly big countries, the likes of Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, they tend to have quite a massive amount of shares within the bank itself. But obviously there are some non-African bank members as well. But also during the course of the day, Tammy, for example, the outgoing president, Adesina, was really talking about some of their successes, but also highlighting some of the very key challenges that are still facing the continent.
So should the bank fail, Kaelihle, to persuade the United States to reinstate the funding or alternatively to raise funding elsewhere, what impact will this have on the continent's poor nations that get favorable lending rates from the bank?
That would be very devastating, Tommy, especially because we know that the African Development Bank, it works very hard in terms of supporting member states, in terms of their developmental agenda. For example, Dr. Adesina was talking about his recent visit in Lesotho, in Cape Verde, and many other parts of the continent, because also, for example, they look at these 5 priorities. It's all about making sure that you power up Africa, you integrate Africa, you feed Africa, but also making sure that in that particular process, you're able to mobilize the resources and support the member states, especially because these are very untenable times. You've got climate change as one of the biggest challenges facing the world, and inevitably the African continent is really bearing the brunt of this massive issue. And we know that with Dr. Adesina, that's been a very critical issue in terms of really just propelling the developmental agenda of the continent.
And what other activities are planned for this week?
Well, obviously, it's going to be a long haul. Today, it was just a breakfast with the president of the bank, Adesina, talking about the priorities in Africa, repositioning Africa, but obviously quite a number of side events. We know that during the course of the day, there'll be an issue. For example, looking at the debt issue in Zimbabwe, we expect the finance minister of Zimbabwe to attend that particular session to look at how Harare is dealing with this particular issue, because as much as it is a problem in Zimbabwe, but quite a number of countries in the global south, they are battling with this issue of debt sustainability. But obviously quite a very jam-packed program in terms of so many other issues as well, in terms of the priorities of the continent, especially since we are right in West Africa, Tammy. You know that from time to time, this is a region that is facing a number of issues when it comes to instability, you know, with the coups, but obviously what is key is that you need to get stability right in the country so that development can flourish.
And that there is my colleague Tabin Gomedi. They're speaking to our other colleague, Kaelihle Khumalo, who is in Cote d'Ivoire for that vote of the new AFDB president. Let's continue now with more news here on Africa World Hour. We're talking about officials of the Democratic Republic of Congo who say they are optimistic about reaching a deal with Washington, one that would bring about U.S. investment into the country, particularly the vast reserves of critical minerals. But it's not just about resources. Peace talks are also in motion to end a long-running rebellion in the eastern parts of the Congo, a conflict the DRC says is fueled by illegal mineral smuggling backed by neighboring Rwanda. To help us unpack the geopolitical, economic and humanitarian implications of this developing story, we're joined now from London by Christopher Van Derm, a senior research fellow with Chatham House and a PhD candidate at Wits University here in Johannesburg. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Christopher.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on.
So let's just first start with what research you've done on this particular subject and what your interests are in it, not only as Chatham House, but you personally.
Yeah, well, the work I'm doing at WITS is looking at credible commitment and mining investment. So what are the policies that governments can put in place that ensure that there's equitable benefit from the mining industry, but also put in place policies where there's enough consistency and coherence that private companies will invest and over time they'll be confident that their investment will stay in place and won't succumb to resource nationalism pressures from the government. The work we're doing at Chatham House, far more complicated. We are working quite a lot on the issue of traceability. So how is it that we know where minerals come from, particularly looking at what's going on in Eastern DRC, as well as the geopolitics around critical minerals? So how can Africa benefit from the EU critical mineral strategy, from the American approach to trying to bolster critical minerals and its own Inflation Reduction Act, and now subsequently what Donald Trump is doing in looking for critical minerals, as well as how Africa leverages with other global partners to maximize the benefit. So we're doing quite a wide range of work on this topic.
And you know, this is what is intriguing about this particular deal of not only the United States seeking to broker a peace deal between Rwanda and the DRC, but the fact that itself has its own interest in the critical minerals that it needs itself. So is it a deal that can survive scrutiny, especially if we say there's a need for transparency? We're talking about very sensitive issues here. We're talking about the need to enshrine human rights issues in this agreement, but also ensure that there is an enabling environment for a deeper governance architecture that'll allow the DRC government to be able to withstand these kind of complications.
Yeah, it's really complicated. And at a very high level, you can see that some of this is driven by the necessity of both geology and geopolitics. By that, I mean, there are certain places in the world where there are higher concentration of the deposits of certain minerals. Now, we talk about critical minerals as a group, but that can involve anything from 18 to 30 different minerals, depending on who's classifying them. What we're really looking at in the Eastern DRC is tin, tantalum, and tungsten, which are known as the 3 Ts. Elsewhere in the country, there's deposits of lithium, manganese, and huge amounts of copper and cobalt, of course. But in that area in the Eastern DRC, it's the 3 Ts and gold, so 3TG. Now, the next layer down, when you talk about, so what role can the US play? And that's the real complication here. And what the DRC government sought to do much earlier in the year was, when they saw that the US had approached and was in discussion with the government in Ukraine around a mineral deal there, as a kind of a backstop to peace negotiations in Ukraine, the DRC government sought to leverage position with the American government, particularly given that the US knew that the DRC government was already trying to renegotiate some of its agreements with China, on whom it felt that it had become overly dependent. So it was trying to cozy up to Washington anyway, saw what was going on in Ukraine and said, well, okay, we've actually got much better mineral endowments than they've got in Ukraine. Why don't you come here and why don't we strike a deal? That clearly piqued the Americans' interest, but a lot of the mineral deposits that sit in that part of the country straddle the border. So they're also present in Rwanda as well. And so to some extent, the American administration called the bluff of the DRC and said, look, we're not going to have a bilateral USA-DRC mineral deal. There is already something in place where the Americans are underpinning an agreement between the DRC and Zambia around the development of electric vehicle batteries. So rather than an additional mineral for security just with DRC, what the Americans then inputted into what's quite a complex range of mediation processes that are currently taking place, what the Americans have said is, well, why don't we have a minerals agreement with the DRC and a minerals agreement with Rwanda, and these two separate agreements can underpin a broader peace in the region. So it's this complicated mix, but as I say, it's, as far as the Americans are concerned, it is that mix of geology and geopolitics, and what they can find in Eastern DRC, particularly coltan, which the town of Rubaya, which is currently under M23 control, has the highest deposits of coltan in the world. And then over the border in Rwanda, you've got deposits of tungsten, and it's one of the biggest tungsten producers after China, Russia, and North Korea. So you can start to see where this fits into the American psyche.
And I suppose for me, it's one simple question that you pointed to, the critical minerals race with China, and for the United States to be involved in any deal in which it would be able to extract exactly what it's seeking for in this deal. And while the DRC says it's seeking for protection, what would make the U.S. the country that actually ensures the end of this conflict in the Eastern DRC, something that's been running for decades long, and it's been so difficult to bring to an end? I mean, China itself has operations there. There are other countries, Canadian countries, but they have had to halt their operations in order to see through their interests.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and this is going to be the real test of this agreement. Is to some extent it's predicated on this idea that the economic incentive of doing business with America would be so great that that can overcome people's political and personal grievances that they've got within that conflict zone. Now that sounds like a very, very grand ambition, and so I think that it's going to have to be buttressed by other initiatives on the ground, and I think that that's where the wider range of mediation efforts come in. You know, there has been some talk of a American private military contractor that has started a presence in the country, but they're unlikely, or at the moment they've postponed their activities in the east of the country, focusing on the south. And so there's big questions around kind of how politically palatable it would be. You know, would it be accepted to have American troops on the ground or American private forces on the ground in what's already a very complicated situation? So it's got to be predicated on that. But, you know, in this, there are some green shoots. There is some learning. So, for example, in that region of the Eastern DRC, the vast majority of mining is ASM, artisanal and small-scale mining. Now, in other products in the southern part of the country, such as cobalt, you've actually seen a decrease in ASM cobalt mining as it's been taken over by more industrial players. And I think that this is what the Americans are kind of putting forward, is that there could be some means of extracting the material in the Eastern DRC and in Rwanda that offers jobs, offers much better employment, or offers better trading terms, and better access and fairer access into international markets. It could look a little bit like some of the operations that are already there, where they've taken existing ASM operations and consolidated them and then put in some industrial mining. So it could look like that. And it could unlock some significant financial flows from the US government, who via other private holding companies, you've got this movement of US federal capital into the private sector, then disseminated and invested into different projects. An agreement could involve that kind of financial investment that is desperately needed in some of these areas. And so that's, you know, that's the hope, is that the offer could really say, okay, let's work together. And that's why it's so crucial that both Rwanda and DRC are involved in this.
Well, that brings me to my next important question, Christopher, because you spoke about traceability earlier on. And if there's going to be some sort of legitimate cross-border trade agreement, those issues would have to be resolved at first, right? Because we've seen, and it has been proven, that there has been a movement of some of these minerals across the border, even though it is claimed by, in some cases, Rwanda. And we also know that in the DRC as well, that the number, particularly in the eastern parts, the area where the conflict is concentrated, that a lot of those rebel groups that have grown over time, it's also as a result of the battle over who legitimately not only owns the land, who is a native of that land, and therefore the minerals. So how can the United States then talk about a fair agreement when internally that is the major source of strife, and that was what spawned so many rebel groups in that area. I think in the Kivu area already there's more than 20 rebel groups of pretty much the same interests.
Yeah, look, an agreement is not a panacea. We're not going to have a sign on the dotted line and then it's going to completely reshape what is a deeply entrenched supply chain of vested interests, some with links back to the capital city and political players, that has been relatively robust through different cycles of conflict. That's not going to happen overnight. And that's the point around traceability that you say. It's, how do we know where stuff comes from? And I think that's got to be a prerequisite for moving on with any agreement. In conversations with African Union partners, for example, they've mentioned other conflicts on the continent, particularly historically in the 1990s, and some of the pressure on the diamond trade in Sierra Leone and Angola, for example. They've mentioned that as a test case of we need to understand where product is coming from. We need to understand where it goes, and we need to make sure that conflict actors aren't part of that supply chain. So in the DRC, the government has been part of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. So the regional partners are already part of a regional mechanism that has a traceability mechanism as part of that. The questions arise is, okay, who is part of this traceability mechanism? Are we reliant too much on state agents who can be corruptible? Are we reliant too much on technology, which can be high cost? And if it's reliant on data and it's self-reliant on electricity, that's difficult to implement in very remote locations. And so there are existing mechanisms and existing ways of doing this. I don't think that we're at a sweet spot yet where we've got a solution that is scalable, that is workable, and that is affordable, particularly when we're talking about artisanal miners who are making very little money themselves, and so they don't have a huge amount to be able to then invest or spend on some of these higher cost mechanisms. But we are getting to a point where there is not only the ability to start getting a better understanding of where things are coming from, there's also an international pressure and requirement to understand where things are coming from. And it's not just about where it was historically, particularly from the European Union, saying into the EU, we don't want to buy anything that hasn't been responsibly sourced. Or from America, where there's American legislation around conflict 3TG, for example, where they're saying, no, if we don't want anything that's tainted by conflict, and you've got to report your supply chains to the SEC. We're now seeing players like China increasingly with more stringent responsible sourcing controls. And also, given that China is now in a trade competition with the United States and is a major producer of many of the other critical minerals that the US is interested in, China itself is becoming much more interested in where do we think our product is coming from, and where do we know that it is going after it's been through our processes. So the Chinese themselves are coming into the fold. So, we're getting to a point now where this is starting to become a reality and a possibility.
Christopher, really thank you for your time and sharing your insights with us. Christopher Van Dome is a Senior Research Fellow with Chatham House Africa Programme, which he speaks to us from London, and he was also a doctorate candidate at Wits University. Brings the time to 25 minutes to 10.
Africa in Business on Channel Africa.
The president of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, BADEA, Dr. Sidi Ould Tah, he is vying for the presidency of the African Development Bank, the AFDB. He positions himself as a fervent defender of economic integration and structural transformation on the African continent.
So I do believe that I have a 360 view of the development challenges in the continent with my experience from from both the supply side and the demand side. But more importantly, my vision is to bring on board all the stakeholders and to have a holistic approach for the development of the continent and to develop partnership across the continent and outside the continent, bringing all the stakeholders together to work for one goal is to make Africa great for life and livelihood of the African population.
Bringing the African markets into your home. Channel Africa, the African perspective. At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Magweta.
Channel Africa.
And we continue with Africa World Hour. The United Kingdom and Mauritius recently signed a treaty on the future of the Chagos Archipelago, a remote Indian Ocean territory at the heart of a decades-long human rights controversy. Over half a century ago, the UK and US forcibly displaced the entire indigenous Chagosian population to make way for a US military base on Diego Garcia. The displacement, described by many, including Human Rights Watch, as an ongoing colonial crime, has left generations of Chagosians in exile fighting for justice, recognition, and the right to return. To help us examine the human rights implications of this deal, we're joined now by Ashwani Budu-Skoltz, Deputy Director of the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you for having me, Tsepiso, and hello to your listeners.
And perhaps we should start with, a basic ABC history. And I mean, I've just given the geographical explanation of who and where the Chagosians are situated. But where did this begin? How did it begin?
Okay, before I start, let me just say I appreciate you calling them indigenous people, because this is one of the things that we've been fighting for and we've included in our report why they should be considered. So it all started 60 years ago when the UK government secretly planned with the United States to force an entire indigenous people, the Chagosians, from their home in the Chagos Archipelago. And those islands were part of Mauritius, which was then a UK colony. So the two governments agreed that there will be a military base on Diego Garcia and that the island inhabitants would be removed. So from 1965 to 1963, the UK and US forced the entire Chagosian population from the islands, and they were moved to Seychelles and Mauritius, where they lived, and if I can add, they're still living in abject poverty. And years later, the UK paid through the Mauritian government, because it doesn't recognize Chagosians as a group in their own right, a small amount of compensation. And decades later, it started awarding citizenship to Chagosians. And for many years, the government of Mauritius has claimed that it should be getting sovereignty over Mauritius. And in 2022, November, that was when it was announced that they have open negotiations. And as you mentioned, last Thursday, they agreed on a treaty. This is just the background.
Mm-hmm. So just tell me, the Chagosians, the Aborigine of the Diego Garcia Island?
So they were brought to the islands from Africa, mainland Africa. Mm-hmm. And they've worked as slaves. They were brought by the French, because Mauritius was colonized by the French, and subsequently the British. And we say that they are an indigenous people under the United Nations and the African standards, because over the years, they have become a distinct people with a culture and language. And the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is the human rights body of the African Union, has said that there are 4 key criteria for identifying indigenous peoples. First, occupation and use of a specific territory, which they were doing before they were forcibly displaced. Voluntary perpetuation of cultural distinctiveness. They do have a certain type of food, for instance. They have their own particular dance. Self-identification as a distinct collectivity, so they do identify themselves as Chagossians, and an experience of subjugation, marginalization, dispossession, exclusion, and or discrimination, which they have met when they were being moved from the islands. And it is to be noted that the existence and recognition of the Mauritian people does not prevent the Chagossians being an indigenous group that's distinct from Mauritius. It could be that even if at that time it was even if now it's under Mauritian sovereignty, Chagossian people are a group of people that needs to be recognized, as you have many indigenous groups across the world.
And I do ask this because when you speak about this new treaty and the agreement that has been reached, you say Mauritius has or it's been agreed that it will resettle people on the Chagos Island other than on Diego Garcia. So, and there are reparations that are being discussed there as well. So I just also want to just get an understanding of, so if the people who drew up the treaty do not acknowledge their claims land, as you say, and the amount of time, lifespan that they've had, including the traditions and culture that they've built on the land, surely that will impact on the final deal and whether it's satisfactory or not.
You're so correct, Dipiso. So Chagossians that we spoke to for our report in 2023, we've been keeping up in contact with them, especially with the treaty negotiation process. And some of them, especially a group in Mauritius, have had consultations with the government of Mauritius during the negotiations. But the others, those in UK and those in Seychelles, are nowhere part of this process. They have been completely left out. And there are quite a couple of Chagossians or people of Chagossian descent there. So they have not been included in the negotiation process. So you're talking about a group of people without them, and you're talking about their right to return with a government that considers itself to have, considers Chagossians as its subjects. And they've excluded Diego Garcia, as you've mentioned. And this still perpetuates the ongoing colonial crime of forced displacement. And it shows that there was more economic interests at heart, because they're getting a lot of money. Every year for the next 99 years, the UK would pay Mauritius £101 million a year for the military base, and there's also a 40 million trust fund that the UK has proposed for consolidating the trust fund. So the question arises, of course, there's the whole sovereignty issue for Mauritius, and it's true that it's in the right direction with the UK handing over sovereignty, but then did it hand it over to the right people? That is the question.
And this military base, you say it was a UK-US armed forces base. So the settlement on Mauritian land, was it done outside of the acquiescence of Mauritius, especially as the UK says it's doing this now because it faced demand by Mauritius to say pay up now or what? So it almost seems as if they were an unwilling party in all of this.
So Mauritius has been asking for sovereignty of the Chagos Islands for a while now. They say that they were cornered during the negotiation for independence, with the UK creating the British Indian Ocean territories through the Chagos Islands, where they would have exclusive sovereignty and they could manage the islands however they want. So since a few decades now, there have been a push. There have been even advisory opinions at the ICJ. There have been cases in different instances for UK to hand over Chagos to the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. From the Mauritian government perspective, and if you look at the news in Mauritius, it's being celebrated. It's such a big victory for Mauritius because it shows that it's no longer under the British colonial rule, in addition to the compensation that they are getting. And some Chagossians, I'm not going to lie to you, are really celebrating this victory because when I spoke to one of them, they mentioned that this is at least something. We don't know if we're ever going to get this opportunity again. And many of the Chagossians who were forcibly displaced, so actually dying because they're old now, and the fight is now on to their descendants. And some of them might not have as much affinity to the land as others, so they are fine to just have some form of monetary compensation. But this compensation, in the 1970s, 80s, there was some form of compensation given through the Mauritian government. But when I spoke to some of the Chagosians, it's so sad, so they live in poverty, like if I can even add abject poverty. And they will tell you that they got that money, but some of them actually used it to pay their debts. It was not a lot of money. I think it was about, let me say, 15,000 rands, if I can convert it. So, and that's not enough. Like they needed the money to build houses. They needed the money to send their children to school. Even if education is free in Mauritius, you still have incidentals like school uniform, like books. It was sad to hear how that money did not take them far. And there's a Chagos Welfare Fund that even the UK now has said it's going to consolidate with that $40 million, but it needs to be seen how that's going to be implemented. Like in the previous format, they would provide for scholarships, they would help Chagosians, but some group I spoke to said it depends on who you're close to. So it's not all Chagosians, right?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I was actually thinking about that. I mean, as is the case with land resettlement, and the claiming of ancestral land, even here in South Africa, even people who do not qualify, who would not be Chagosians, would find themselves getting that money that should go directly to them.
I'm not going to confirm that, because from our research, that's not a question that we looked into. But what we researched and what we found was that, let's say there's Group A Chagosians and then there's Group B Chagosians. And Group A is closer to the government, it has members on the board, and they would benefit more from those resources. But then, funnily enough, I saw a caricature in the Mauritian news this morning about how the coffers were empty, and then they're like, how are we going to finance it? And then they were saying the Chagos money is coming in soon. So we need to see whether the money that they're receiving for the military base or for Diego Garcia is being used for Chagosians. Because if you look at the treaty, it doesn't say that that money has to be used for Chagosians. It's only that $40 million, pounds, that's allocated for Chagosians. So we really don't know.
So the Mauritian president was saying that it's time that Chagosians get access to their land. Is this then going to happen, and do we know what timeline there is?
So there's no timeline, right? Even in the treaty, they don't. They just say that there's no timeline. There's this provision on resettlement of Chagosians, and then it says that Mauritius is free to implement a program of resettlement on the other islands except for Diego Garcia, but it doesn't provide a timeline. I think everyone is still rejoicing the fact that this agreement was signed. Not everyone, but like those who are going to benefit, obviously. And also, it's a like Tsepiso, I'm saying all this, but then overall it's a win, right? But it's a win with a lot of drawbacks for the Chagosians. But it's a win in a way against colonialism. But it's a win with dark clouds looming around because Chagosians did not. Yeah, because Chagosians did not participate fully. And before the agreement was signed, actually on Thursday, 2 Chagosians from the UK had sought an interim injunction from the High Court in the UK, which they got. But then that was lifted, and they tell you like they don't think they will ever go back to their country. So according to some of them, they don't think it's ever going to materialize.
Ashwani, thank you so much for speaking to us. We're grateful for the education. Ashwani Boudou-Scholtz, the Deputy Director of the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch, just speaking to us about this deal between the UK and Mauritius, a treaty on the future of the Chagos Archipelago, a remote Indian Ocean territory at the heart of what's being called a decades-long human rights controversy.
Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
As we wrap up, water is once again flowing through the Lesotho Highlands Water Project Tunnel, a crucial cross-border lifeline between Lesotho and South Africa. Following a 6-month maintenance shutdown, the tunnel has officially reopened, restoring a vital water supply to millions. Channel Africa's Lebogang Mabange brings us the full story from Clarence in the Free State province.
The reopening of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project Tunnel marks a major milestone for South Africa and Lesotho, ensuring continued water security for millions. The tunnel, which was shut down on the 1st of October 2024, was due for routine maintenance scheduled every 5 years. South Africa completed its share of the work on time, but delays on the Lesotho side extended the shutdown. Minister of Water and Sanitation in South Africa, Phemi Majodina, explains.
By March, our team, South African team, was done with the major maintenance. As you know, that this is the project between two countries, Lesotho and South Africa. We were done on time, right on time. By the 31st of March, we were done and dusted on the South African side. However, on the Lesotho side, they were not done. Their delays were caused by inclement weather. They couldn't work on the site. They requested additional 3 weeks to mid-April.
The Lesotho Highlands Water Project is one of the most important binational infrastructure initiatives on the continent, supporting water delivery and economic development in both countries. Deputy Minister of Water and Sanitation David Mahlobo says proper maintenance will extend the life of the tunnel and help secure future supply.
One of the most important aspects is that this tunnel, as it exists between the two countries, it's an important milestone because if the tunnel is maintained, in other words, the useful life of this particular asset get enhanced. Now that this tunnel, it normally gets to be, there's a scheduled maintenance over a period of 5 years. And every 5 years when you do it, you can increase the lifespan by more than 20 to 25 years. That's what we'll do. And when this tunnel now is available for the next 25 years, it then guarantees the assurance of availability of water.
But the tunnel does more than just transport water. It powers livelihoods, support agriculture, and even electricity generation. Deputy Minister Mahlobo adds.
This tunnel is so important for both two countries. On the Lesotho side, you know that they were blessed with water, especially the winter rainfall that they have. They get royalties so that they can stimulate their economies. The communities that side, they are getting jobs in terms of what we are doing, but more importantly, they are also being in a position to produce electricity. On our side, this particular tunnel feeds into an important system. It's called the Integrated Vaal River System. The Integrated Vaal River System is supplied the Vaal Dam, supported by 14 other dams. It supplies more than 12 to 14 million South Africans.
Maintenance of the tunnel involved intensive work on both the infrastructure and coordination between the countries. Teboho Nkahle, South Africa's representative overseeing the project, gives insight into what the technical work involved.
The total length of the steel, that side, that was repainted, was about 2 kilometers, 2.168 kilometers. And the total surface was about 19,000 square meters. And we had to use about 43,000 liters of paint, 2,200 tons of sand to sandblast the old paint. It's been a very challenging journey. We missed our deadline, our self-imposed deadline of the 30th of March, but we are here. We've opened the water is running, so we have delivered, finally.
Despite the setbacks, water once again flows through the Clarence Tunnel, a lifeline for communities and industries alike. And with the project now complete, both South Africa and Lesotho look to the future, fortified by this joint achievement. Reporting for Channel Africa, I am Lebogang Mabange in Clarence, Free State Province of South Africa.
And ending off with news that we've been watching, South Africa's Umkhonto weSizwe's Member of Parliament, Colleen Makhubele, says easing of regulations by the Minister of Communications, Solly Malatsi, cannot be done without the approval of Parliament. Makhubele, who recently wrote to the Minister of opposing the gazetted Regulation 17.8 under the State Information Technology Agency Act, says Malatsi must retract an unlawful and illegal regulation. Malatsi will appear before Parliament's Communications Portfolio Committee after he gazetted a draft policy direction last Friday that may clear the way for tech billionaire Elon Musk's Starlink to operate in the country. Starlink is the world's first and largest network of satellites using a low Earth orbit to deliver broadband internet access to over 60 countries. Zara Groenewald has more.
Controversy is brewing over the potential easing of regulations by Communications Minister Solly Malatsi over US company Starlink. Starlink is a network of satellites operated by Elon Musk's SpaceX, providing satellite internet access coverage to a number of countries, including neighboring Botswana, Lesotho, and Mozambique. Leading tech evangelist Aki Anastasio explains.
Starlink is another alternative way of providing internet connectivity in very remote areas. So what Starlink does is they've got these satellites, they're called low orbit satellites, that sit about 600 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and they just transmit down to Earth. They transmit data. If you've got a receiver and you want to connect to the internet, it allows you to connect. They've got about 8,000 of these satellites that really blanket the Earth and just allows you to connect to the internet in remote areas, providing low latency, high-speed connectivity.
On Friday, Malatsi gazetted a policy in which broad-based black economic empowerment policies will be eased to accommodate such companies. A member of the official opposition who serves in Parliament's Communications Portfolio Committee says these regulations will never be approved without the buy-in of legislators. MK Party MP Colleen Makhubele says these draft regulations are anti-transformative and has demanded Malatsi account before parliamentarians on Tuesday.
It cannot be done without the approval of Parliament, let me put it that way, because the legislature, the acts, this is a function of Parliament, and we have an oversight role as legislators and in our committees to oversee it. And if you want to do anything, introduce regulations, you must first change the act. So you can't introduce a junior regulation to ease without changing the act. It cannot be in conflict with the act. And even in introducing regulations, there are processes that you follow that have been flawed already.
Other parties have raised their objections to the draft regulations, citing that the rules cannot be bent to favour Musk. These include ANC's First Deputy Secretary General Nomvulo Mokoyane and EFF leader Julius Malema.
South Africa cannot create laws specifically for Elon Musk. We know that even with the World Cup, the amendment of the legal framework had to do with what is good for South Africa. And even in this instance, we know that the issues about what the minister has raised must actually find expression in the parliamentary processes.
The following day, they issue out that they want to relax the PEE deals so that this Starlink can come into South Africa. There is no such a law in South Africa. That Starlink will not come into South Africa if it's not compliant with the PEE. We are not saying 30% must go to one individual. That 30% must go to black people.
Meanwhile, the DA has welcomed the proposed amendments. This is DA MP Tsolofelo Budlani.
The DA welcomes the move by Minister Malatsi on the proposed amendments to the country's ICT legislation. The historic lack of political will and failure to amend legislation has delayed our development. This has hindered access to the economy for many South Africans. We call on all South Africans to use this opportunity to make their views known and to help ensure that their voices are heard during this historic period.
The public has 30 days to comment on the draft regulations. I am Zara Groenewald in Johannesburg.
And that's how we come to the end of the Monday edition of Africa World Hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Do enjoy the rest of your listening here and viewing as we're live streaming to you here on Channel Africa. Up next, of course, is Hotlines with Shayla and Gumana. From us, it's goodbye for now.
Tshepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m. Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark.